Welcome to the Old Fashion Masonic Podcast, where we talk all things Masonic while drinking an old fashioned. I'm Brian.
I'm Russ.
I'm Dave.
So, guys, Dave is our resident historian, so anytime we talk about history, theories, nonsense, Dave Thomas is our guy. So, today, Dave, we are talking about Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper. So, Dave's going to keep us on track. We're going to talk a little bit about the history. We've got laptops up, notes, all sorts of nonsense. So stay with us. There's a lot of stuff going on here.
But before we get started, so Brian, we are in your
We're in the new room.
And there are 3 posters that you won't be able to see, but one of them is From Hell, which...
No, it's not From Hell the place. It's a movie poster.
The movie
poster.
From Hell, which we might actually discuss today.
We'll probably reference
Yes.
what we feel about that movie one way or the other.
Yes.
It's
It might
called
come up.
From Hell with Johnny Depp. So look that up if you want some stuff that's horseshit.
Yes.
So, all right, I digress. So Jack the Ripper, obviously, not his real name, but murdered at least 5 women in or near the Whitechapel district and London's East End between August and November of 1988.
1888.
Sorry. 5 murders, and they were all kind of linked to a single murderer. Each instance, the victim's throat was cut or the body was unusually mutilated, and the suspicion was that somebody had to have some sort of knowledge of the human anatomy. Authorities received a series of taunting notes from a person calling himself Jack the Ripper, saying he was the murderer. A lot of stuff going on. They tried to trap the killer, and it just never happened. Huge public uproar to arrest a murderer. What's going on? The London Police Commissioner, who was also a Mason, by the way, he ended up resigning later. There was just so much heat on him, and I don't know if he resigned or they called for his resignation or all of the above. Right? Do you know his name? You probably have his name, son. It's interesting. So as we digress,
The investigator, Morse?
I don't know.
the commissioner.
Oh, commissioner.
So we're going to talk about 5 victims. Mary Ann Nichols, she was found on August 31st. Annie Chapman was found September 8th. Elizabeth Stride was found September 30th. That same night, Catherine Kate, we don't know if it's Eddowes, but it's Eddowes.
Eddowes.
Was also found on the 30th. And then on November 9th, Mary Jane Kelly, I'm going to ignore my notes, was found on the 9th. Now, 4 of the 5...
Yeah, so something interesting about 4 of the 5, they were in their 40s, between 43 and 46 years of age.
Interesting.
And then Mary Kelly was only 25, I believe.
25. Didn't know that. So all but Mary Kelly were assumed to be prostitutes, and apparently they were old prostitutes. So that's, I guess...
I think that was a common age at that time
For
prostitutes.
Yeah. All right.
Because prostitutes were people that had been down on their luck and, cast aside. And so a lot of them were later in life.
Well, all right. So they're aged to perfection. So there we go. So now we're going to... That was the first one, Russ.
That was good.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the suspects, and then this is where we're going to start to get wild. One of the most prominent suspects, so why we're talking about this on the Old Fashion Masonic Podcast is there's a theory that the Masons were covering up for Jack the Ripper for some sort of reason. So one suspect we'll talk about is Prince Albert Edward Victor, part of the royal family. An opinion was, you know what, we'll talk about that opinion later. So Montague Druitt, he was a barrister and a teacher, had some interest in surgery, who was later said to be insane, but he disappeared after the final murders and was found dead later. He was a suspect. Michael Ostrog, which was a kind of a newer name for you with your research. He was a Russian criminal and physician who had been placed in an asylum because of his homicidal tendencies. Aaron Kaminsky, he was a resident of the Whitechapel area. He had a great hate of women, particularly prostitutes, and he was hospitalized and put in an asylum.
He was a Polish immigrant.
He was a Polish-Jewish immigrant.
Polish-Jewish immigrant.
Which definitely comes into some facts later on.
Yes.
It does.
Yes.
Very much so.
Yeah, one of the reasons why he is some historians' top suspect.
Okay.
But yeah, he was also, not mentioned here, a barber and hairdresser. And we separate the two. Anybody that's been to cosmology school or knows somebody that knows the reason that a barber, more than a hairdresser, is somebody who has been trained to shave
Razor blades.
with long razors. And so that comes into effect here as well.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about that part. That's new. All right. Walter Sickert, he was a physician. I have to imagine at the time there was so much stuff going on. There were all sorts of suspects. Oh my gosh, Russ has garden shears, and this could have happened. So,
And Brian is who he is. And
that's
so
true. Well, I got some tendencies. That's a whole other thing. So, Sir Walter Goal, he was also a subject of speculation. Then there were Goldstern Graffito, James Maybrick, Michael Maybrick, Charles Warren, who was a Freemason. James Kelly, he became a real big topic at one point. He had killed his wife in the same manner, and some of the victims were. He was sentenced to death, but then avoided due to he was crazy as hell, right? But around that time, the murder stopped. But a lot of things, it's like you get your horoscope after the day happens. Like, oh, it makes sense. He was sent to a mental hospital. Several years later, he fashioned a key out of steel and escaped. And then just all of a sudden appears in 1927. He's a much older person at that time. But he mapped out all the places that he had lived. And there were many murders across that, not just in the East End, but that were murdered in a similar fashion. And then the photos from the drawings that they had, sketches they had for Jack the Ripper, and photos of him at the time, they said were, quote, uncanny. So he really became a suspect after the fact. So we're going to talk about some theories before Dave gets in and really messes with us. He's gonna mess our brain up, I'm sure. So Prince Albert, here's kind of the Masonic tie. He was rumored, and I think this is where movie From Hell kind of took off, right? Mm-hmm. He was rumored to have gotten a prostitute pregnant, and the royal family wanted to cover it up. I mean, who hasn't? So that's just one of those things. So the royal family did not want to be caught up in some scandal of, we've got some really bastard child out there that Prince Albert, you need to Google this guy, Prince Albert Edward Victor. He liked to increase his averages of closing deals. So he batted for every team, let's just say that. So another theory that came out in the last 10 years, Sir John Williams. He was a royal family surgeon. The last victim, Mary Jane Kelly, right? Is she the last one?
She was 5, yeah.
5. The great-great-great-granddaughter of her says that a locket that the family had found had contained a photo of Sir John Williams after she died, and subsequently the killing stopped. When they looked through her diary, they had shown, the diary had talked about this 2-year affair that she had with the royal family surgeon, and they had gone to Paris and everywhere. And so speculation was that he was the killer because she was the last one killed in that same way. Go back to DNA. So let's stop there. Fill us in. We've missed a suspect at least.
Right.
So let's fill us up where we've missed.
Well, let's start with Prince Albert Victor.
Okay.
So he is the grandson of Queen Victoria, and a Mason, I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
So one of the historians I read, John Williams, he brings this up in his book about Jack the Ripper as a suspect and as a Masonic conspiracy, and he basically laughs about it. So the idea of somebody from the royal family personally visiting Whitechapel was laughable to him.
Because it was just such a trash area at the time.
Yeah, I mean, he is more likely to have been murdered than be a murderer in that area.
Okay.
Right. First of all, anybody that might recognize him, but also just the clothing and stuff that he would have worn. Just he would have stood out. His mannerisms, everything.
So you don't even think he went to the East End to even pick up prostitutes?
I don't.
Okay,
and
fair.
one of the reasons is in the same book, John Williams, he brings up another book about how there was kind of a prostitution ring that was pseudo-sanctioned by the royal family for the royal men, right? And so when you wanted a prostitute as a prince or whatever, one was delivered to you. You didn't have to run around in the slums to find one. So obviously there's
Uber cheats.
nice. Yeah, the back page of the 19th century.
Yeah.
So wait, is Backpage still around?
I don't know. I don't
Russ?
think so.
I have no idea.
Okay, all right.
But yeah, Russ is lying.
Right, yeah, he's lying. He knows.
So, but yeah, so he found that laughable that Prince Edward Victor would be in the area at all, let alone get involved with a prostitute. Not at all unlikely that the prostitute might get pregnant by him. Right. We're not saying that he wasn't involved in that kind of thing, but just in that area. And then to be able to move in and out of Whitechapel the way Jack the Ripper had to have done is just unlikely for a member.
So we can knock out the royal family. Well,
So at no point in time do you think that she would have been one that might have been delivered to him?
Oh.
I mean, possibly.
But
Possibly.
if they're older,
Yeah.
I mean,
Because how old was he? He was
he
young.
was in his 20s.
Yeah.
Right. And Mary Jane is the only one that has been indicated as being buxom and beautiful. Right. The others
Right.
were.
Yeah.
So you can't tell from the photo that we have of
Right.
Mary Jane. But
Yeah. Quick talk about photos. Russ had done some research and was talking about what website you pull this from?
This was just from Jack the Ripper Murder Mystery Solved by DNA.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so Russ is talking about this gruesome photo that's on here, and then Dave said that's one of the
Yeah, I read that it was the first crime scene photograph. It could have been just one of the early ones,
Sure,
but
yeah.
certainly the most notorious. And it's gruesome. I don't know if you're going to show it in the podcast.
we will not
we
show
won't.
this.
But it's one of those where there's bones showing and
Right,
her face
right.
is gone, and it's disturbing.
It's easily researchable, so if you want to look it up, you can. Just be warned once you see it.
Yes,
there's no
you're not
seeing
going
it.
to.
But Dave made a great comment about photos that they would take. Talk about the eyes.
Right. So there was a belief at the time, because it was prior to forensic science, that if you looked at the eyes of the victim, and in this case took very close photographs of the eyes of a victim, you might be able to see their last sights. Obviously, we know that's a bunch of bunk now, but
Crazy
at
though,
the time, so whoever this poor photographer was got up close and personal with that body and took the very first photos of close-up victims' eyes.
Wow. So all right. So where else? So who else? Who did we leave off as a suspect?
There is a guy that's been talked about for the last 10 years or so. A book came out, Charles Leshmere. He also went by the name of Charles Scott, and he actually gave a false name when talking to the police about the first murder. So he was the person that found the first murder victim. She had her throat cut, but she was stabbed. She was not disemboweled like the other victims. Nothing else happened. Almost as if he was caught early before he could, finish the crime. And so the new theory is that he was the actual murderer, and somebody else found the body. He was interrupted, right? And so he played it off as if he had just found the body.
And maybe trying to resuscitate or doing whatever.
Right.
Fascinating.
And so, he could have been the one. There's a growing number of people that have him at the top of their list. I was surprised by it because I had researched the top 10 suspects that the police listed, and he was not one of them. And but reviewing the evidence,
he gave multiple names, right?
Yeah. It was at least one false name. I believe it was Scott. Let me pull up Cross. Cross. Okay. Charles Cross was the pseudonym that he gave, and a lot of people believe that he gave the false name because he wanted to separate himself from that murder. So, but they ended up connecting him, the real Leshmere, to that name and to the scene, and he very well could have been. He lived right at the heart of the area where. So, of course, there's no cars, no modes of transportation that gets you around the city pretty quickly. So a lot of the main suspects were people that lived right in the middle of those 5 murders, right? There's a radius, and he was one of those.
Yeah, because their range was limited because of the modes of transportation. Makes sense.
And especially late at night, you commit the murder, you got to escape to your home or wherever it is you're hiding, and you got to do so expeditiously. And the only way to do that is if you lived close. So
okay, all right. So as I was going through, James Kelly was interesting to me because of some things. But for me, what's kind of tightened this up the most, it goes back to Aaron Kaminsky, right? And why was the Polish Jewish thing such a big thing?
So one of the victims, I'm pretty positive is the second victim, there was an eyewitness that saw her and a man in a struggle or violent argument, however you want to put it. The witness that saw the two together could identify the man that he saw. And then the victim was then found 15 to 30 minutes after that altercation. So either that woman had, a couple of violent encounters within an hour, or that witness had actually seen the murder. The witness, like I said, he could positively identify the person in question, but he refused because he said he would not testify against a fellow Jew. He did not want to be responsible for the death of a fellow Jew, and he knew that whoever was caught for this was going to the gallows. So that is one of the strongest pieces of evidence against Kaminsky, is that the police indicated it was Kaminsky that this witness pointed out. Okay. But like I said, he refused to testify in court about it, and so they couldn't use that evidence. But a lot of people point to Kaminsky, and also there is DNA found on the shawl of one of the victims that later on, much later on, about a century later, the DNA was tracked to one of his relatives. But there's a weakness in there too.
Oh, right? Chain of custody. I mean, if you try to float that today with chain of custody with evidence, shout out to our law enforcement. You know what we're talking about. I mean, this thing is handled, and there's so much nonsense on this. And then you threw out some stat between 1 in 10,000, 1 in a billion, or some nonsense.
Yeah. Right. So the 1 in 10,000 is the probability on it that it was, probability is not the right word, but the confirmation is about 1 in 10,000 people could have been the suspect there. Right. Which, in England, even at that time, means there's a couple 100,000 people that it could be. Right. But in today's forensics, they look for something a little closer to 1 in a billion for confirmation that it's, that DNA relates. So, the DNA did test positive that very well could be him based on his descendants, but it's certainly not incontrovertible.
So I know that I saw this scene from Hell, the movie. So help me clarify between motion pictures and reality. Was there in the movie there was basically a scene where there was something written either in blood or whatever, and that basically talked about a statement that at first would lead you to
Masons.
to
the
the
Jews.
Jews.
About
Yes,
Jews,
the Jews.
right.
So
Right.
is that real?
It was definitely real that there was
Okay.
something written, and it also
that was the blood on the wall.
Right. Right. And so Jews was misspelled. The grammar is atrocious in this statement. It was something about the Jews will not be not found. Double negatives but Jews was misspelled Juwes, and some people believe that that's a reference to the biblical jubilo, and jubilah.
Right.
And so there's possibly some Masonic connection there, if that train of thought is accurate. The notations on the wall were taken down by the police and the investigators, and that also fuels some of the conspiracy theorists. But my understanding in reading what the commissioner wrote about that was they did not believe that it was, and it wasn't written in blood, it was written in blood red ink, is my understanding. They believed that it was basically anti-Jewish graffiti. Right.
And this was covered in, so Masons that are watching this, if you go watch From Hell, what Dave is talking about, all of this is just highlighted in this movie.
Yeah.
And that's one part of the movie that is accurate. One that is not, which I found kind of funny. So the commissioner, which we talked about already, I did not make note of his name, the senior investigative officer, the operational detective inspector, which I would believe was Aberline, which is Johnny Depp's character,
Right.
The sergeant, and both of the senior detectives, all of them were Masons.
Including a couple of judges.
Including a couple of judges involved as well, yes. And so that's kind of fueled a little bit of the conspiracy as well.
That's why he didn't get caught, because it was all an internal deal, because
Right.
all the lead people were covering. Fascinating at the time. I'll bet you in today's, with Twitter and all the left and right media spinning all this, they would spin it that way too today.
Possibly.
And it would probably spread faster, obviously, because of everything's at your damn fingertips.
Right. Well, and ironically, that was not conspiracy at the time, right? The Masonic conspiracy came much later. Because at the time, let's paint a picture of Victorian London. There's a 30-year span that Jack the Ripper falls right in the middle of, where Masonry was extremely fashionable. The number of lodges in London alone grew by fourfold during that 30-year span.
Yeah.
It was very likely, if you were educated or had a legitimate career of any type, that you were a Freemason. It was a very high percentage chance.
So the chance of Jack the Ripper being a Mason, well, just because of the sheer volume. Is that your point?
I think you could flip a coin and it would be,
fair.
one way or the other. Him being a Freemason, though, would not indicate Masonry in a conspiracy, right? It would just be the product of the sheer number of Masons that were there at the time, especially if he was somebody educated or a doctor. It would actually be more unlikely for him to not be a Freemason. And what I was starting to talk about, what I thought was so funny from the movie that was inaccurate, is all of these people that I just listed are actually Freemasons or were Freemasons in real life. But in the movie, the surgeon who ended up being the murderer, sorry, spoiler, but it's a 20-year-old movie.
Yeah, it's a 20-year-old movie.
So, it is 20 plus, yeah.
But so the surgeon and there was someone else I can't remember that were indicated as the evil Freemasons in the movie. In real life, they were not Freemasons. So every other character was actually a Freemason, but the ones that were indicated in the film were not. And so I found that funny. But most of that movie is pure fabrication. I mean, Johnny Depp's character has premonitions in his dreams that help him solve murders, and so
they're in opium dens.
Yes, exactly.
I forgot about that part.
And Johnny Depp dies at the end. Spoiler.
Yeah.
Right.
I forgot that.
Yeah, and the real inspector did not. I mean, in fact, another funny part about that is Johnny Depp's character becomes a Freemason in real life about a year after the Jack the Ripper.
Right.
And so if there really was a Masonic conspiracy, you wouldn't think that he would run out and join that organization.
Exactly.
I have up a map of where a lot of the murders happened in the East End. And,
Same website?
same website.
Okay.
And what's funny is in today's society, I don't know that, you basically had to walk all of this.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been carriages, but for the most part, today I think a lot of people are too lazy to do that.
Yes, yeah. I mean,
It's pretty...
I'll
The
drive around
distance
for
is
30
really-
minutes at a grocery store just not to walk 8 more steps.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that we can conclude it with this. Our very uneducated belief is we're going to go on the side of science, even though the chain of custody of that is questionable. But if we had to put a stamp on one person, we're going to say Aaron Kaminsky.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
that
I
he is the
think
guy.
so. Because he was one of the leading suspects from the
beginning.
From the get-go.
Yes.
Right.
And Aberline actually, Aberline later on said, "Oh, you guys got him," when he was in a lunatic asylum, is what they called it back then. He actually said, "You guys found him. You guys got him." And I love that because it really kind of puts the nail in it. But let's also talk about the conspiracy side, the Masonic side, and how much that makes sense at that time. So I'm going to tell you guys something that you probably don't know about me. But about 20 years ago, I was wrong about something. And it's memorable because it never happened before, and it hasn't happened since. But I'm going to go off on a tangent, but it does relate, I promise.
Yeah.
If you listen, the folks that folks that don't know Dave like we know him, this makes me laugh. So go ahead. I'm going to see what kind of trap you're walking us into.
So I was thinking about a song, and I can't remember the name of the song at this point, but I thought it was by David Bowie. And my buddy who was with me said, no way, that's not David Bowie. And I said, I'll prove it. And so I went to my desktop computer and got on Google, because didn't have phones that could search the internet back then. And I looked it up. I put that song in by David Bowie, and sure enough, it popped up. The first few links had that song listed as a David Bowie song. And I said, look, I proved it, right? And he wasn't convinced. He said, there's just no way. So we kept scrolling. And then we found the truth, that it was not a song by David Bowie, but there were some other people out there that were as wrong as I was. And so I learned a real valuable lesson that day about how to research things. Whether you're going to the library or getting on Google, is if you research what you believe, you're going to find it. Right?
Okay.
Google is not a truth engine; it's a search engine. It will give you what you're asking for. And
This went different than I thought it was going to go.
Yes,
I like
very
it.
much so.
There's a book by Bruce Worthington, I believe. It's called Everybody Loves Jack, and he researched this for 15 years, and he is one of the biggest supporters of the Masonic conspiracy. But if you read his previous work, and if you listen to his talks, he's very anti-authoritarian, he is very anti-Masonic, and he was previous to the 15 years that he says he did the research. So I believe that he researched for 15 years about what he believed and not what the actual facts are. And so I think that's something that needs to be remembered.
Yeah,
because
that's fair.
Historians, when they look into it, real historians look at it like scientists do, and they look at the evidence and then develop the story.
Following the science.
Right,
so to speak.
rather than the other way around.
So the one thing about this whole Jack the Ripper thing I find fascinating is that in 1888, from August to November, 5 people were murdered. That's sad that 5 people lost their lives. We today are still talking about this.
Yeah, why is it? Is it
When-
because of the Masonic tie?
Yeah. It
Or
is
it because
for
it's
us.
unsolved? Is it
But
well
is
fair
it,
for us?
Yeah, for us.
Is
But
it because it's unsolved? Is it because they were women? Is it because they were women that were? If it were 5 men, throat cut, would we be talking?
how many
about
people have been killed in Wichita? to date. This year.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not 5. So that's what's
not,
that?
It's not throat cut.
Oh, and just this guy.
By today's standards of a serial killer,
we're desensitized though.
Well,
I think so.
But by today's standards, 5 those are rookie numbers. Right?
They really are.
Right.
Yeah, it's like a Wednesday.
Yeah. But the reason, and you guys both touched on it, the reason that it is still so infamous today, 140 years later, it was unsolved, first of all.
Right.
And the murders were so brutal.
Yeah.
It was very common, actually, for prostitutes to be hurt or murdered at that time, but not in this fashion.
Yeah.
In fact, there's up to 11 murders in that area that they believe could have been.
Yeah,
sure.
this says one map said 7, so that linked them. I've seen. I'm big into gangland slayings, and that's back in the day of the Valentine's Day massacre and whatnot. And you see some of those pictures. You look at these pictures. Somebody did that.
There's some intent.
That's bad.
That's why the Kaminsky thing, the Kaminsky is interesting because of his hate for women.
Yeah.
So any folks that deal with murder scenes now, you kind of look at how it happened, and it's like, there's some sort of, is this personal, is it this? But if he had the great hate of women, particularly prostitutes, as they say, that makes sense for the brutality of it. So, but
that's a whole different level.
That's a whole different level. So, thanks for kind of following with us on our theories, our thoughts, and in conclusion,
if I can conclude, or at least add one more thing to the conspiracy notion, talk about it being unsolved.
Unsolved.
Put yourself in a conspirator's shoes. Would you want people to talk about this murder 140 years later by leaving it unsolved? So if it really was a conspiracy, you're going to have a patsy, you're going to have a scapegoat, right? And there were several people on that list that made excellent scapegoats. Druitt, you brought him up.
Yep, Montague.
He either committed suicide or was murdered himself. They found him in the River Thames. River Thames, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
He's perfect. He found dead a couple months after the murders. No more murders. That's the guy that did it. Let's stop talking about it. That's what I would do as a conspirator.
Okay.
And then there were several people on the top 10 list that either went to prison for other murders or other crimes, or went to the insane asylum. There were several people on that list, surprisingly.
That seemed to be like a thing.
Yeah.
Well,
it was a bigger thing than where they would
just
just dump people in there and forget about them. But very easy to pin a murder on someone like that, or especially Druitt, who is already dead. Don't even have to have a trial now.
Okay.
So if you're going to have a conspiracy, why would you leave it unsolved? That just doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, that's interesting spin.
The unsolved nature of it, I mean, it really speaks honesty to me. So I would leave it there. That I think it's almost laughable that this would be some kind of Masonic conspiracy, and Kaminsky is my guy. There's a number of other really good suspects.
So you really don't believe there's a grassy knoll in London?
No, not in this case, right?
Okay,
right.
But Fair. You know what? That makes sense, and how you kind of close that up. So interesting. So ponder that, folks. Go on whatever place Russ searches for gruesome dead body photos and kind of look at that. So you'll need to do that incognito or clear your search history.
Yeah, save yourself. Just don't go see it. It's bad.
Yeah. So appreciate you. Thanks for following the Old Fashion Masonic Podcast. Cheers.